Welcome to Empowered Life Hacks, where we share with you an explosion of tips to help you overcome your daily struggles. Pay attention for the audio and visual cues, and this will let you know when an actionable idea is right on its way.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. I have a good old friend here named Rajiv, and we had a conversation recently, and I thought he'd be great to come on Empowered Life Hacks and teach you a thing or two about a particular topic. Now, of course, at Empowered Life Hacks, our goal is to give you immediately actionable and digestible tips to help improve your day tomorrow. As you know, reading books and watching a movie on something can take quite a long time, and we just want to give you tips that you can try to improve your life the very next day. And what Rajiv was talking to me about was, unrelated to anything, just telling me how he developed discipline over his life. And it was quite simple yet profound, and it really led him to being able to manage a business and thrive during COVID and just accomplish great things that maybe would be difficult for others, but quite simple for him, just for like very simple morning practices and daily routines. And Rajiv, do you want to just maybe expound on that a little more?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having me. It's cool to be on the show with you. Now, the sort of like the mentality that I adopted a while back was this notion of like breaking things into small chunks.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that, I think the best sort of like way a person could relate to this is if you think back to when you were in school and you look at like how you studied for a test. There were a lot of people who would like cram the night before the test. And especially like in college, you'd see a lot of that. Like people would, fill up their coffee pot or go to like the 24-hour coffee shop on campus at like 10 p.m., pound 3 cups of coffee through the night, and then, go to their test at like 9 a.m. Or maybe they'd like write a paper in that same way, right? And I don't think I ever really did that, or maybe I rarely did. And a lot of it, I think, comes from, I think I wouldn't have been smart enough to know it at the time, but then later would realize it was just kind of like this mindset that my dad had instilled in me. Because the way I would study or the way I would write a paper would be to like progressively learn the subject over several weeks. So there was never this last minute cramming. I think maybe the night before would just be like a final like review of some things. But for the most part, like if the test was, I don't know, let's say the test was on like November 5th. I'm probably studying for that test a little bit, maybe an hour or two, once or twice a week in the 4 weeks leading up to November 5th. And so I was just like progressively learning the material in that way. And what I found is that a lot of people who cram for an exam, they crammed for the purpose of the exam itself. And the second the test is over, you forget all the knowledge. So there was no real necessarily like learning. It was a lot more just like memorizing material to be able to get a good grade on a test. And my mindset was very much one that was like, I would rather get a C and have learned something than get an A and have learned nothing. And I should caveat with, for the classes that I cared about, there's always like the random class you have to take where I'm just like, well, there's no reason this should hurt my GPA. So I should definitely get an A for that, for no other reason than to keep a good GPA. But for all the classes that I cared about, it was, and I'll say this, even like, I think it was like a calculus class I would try to avoid cramming, mainly because I knew it probably wouldn't have been too successful if I crammed. And I've never been the person to be able to like really successfully pull off the quote unquote all-nighter. So when you cram, the night before, you end up, you memorize in order to regurgitate. And I was kind of always saying to myself, I'd rather get a C and have learned something than get an A and have learned nothing. As it so happens, if you apply yourself in that way, you end up getting the A and you learn something, which is, I think, probably the best outcome. But that kind of mindset was instilled in me by my dad, like all through growing up, because he would always tell my brother and I, like, if you have a test in a month, you should be studying a month before that. Now, when we still lived under his roof, of course, we did everything to refute that. And we would not take the advice, or we would find ways to skirt the advice, and not so much the advice, but the mandate. We would end up cramming a lot. And I'll tell you this, I did okay in high school. By Indian parent standards, I did pretty poorly. I think overall I did like okay though. And I think in high school it was like a 5-point scale. And I probably graduated with like a 4.4 or a 4.5, which is good. It's not great. And definitely by Indian parent standards, like I should be getting like a 5.5 out of 5. But then once I got out from under my parents' roof and I was on my own in college, the lessons clearly worked, because all of a sudden, without anyone breathing down my neck, I just started doing that naturally, because I was like, well, I really want to succeed here and I want to learn this material. So that idea of like breaking things into small chunks, in different ways, it's how I've I think operated since then, to either learn material or to just like develop a skill. I think a more kind of like modern way to look at it, modern in the sense of like present day and what I'm doing. I think it's very similar to how many people do, and one should like treat their yoga practice if they're into yoga, where the operative word is that it's a practice. It's not a yoga game. There's not like a winner or a loser. It's just a practice you continuously come back to continue. And it's not even to become the best at it, because that's not the point. But, yoga is about this inner journey. And the more you develop a consistent practice, the deeper you go on that inner journey. My high school track coach would always say, practice doesn't make perfect, but it certainly does make permanent.
That is like it's so simple, right? That statement is like the shortest sentence ever, but it's so profound. That's like the best wisdoms, right? Like you're on a bus and some elderly gentleman says that to you and your life changes forever.
Well, and my track coach I think he was like a 70-year-old or maybe a 60-plus-year-old man at the time. So he was the elderly gentleman.
He had to be efficient with his mind faculties. And yeah, there's so much to take away from that. And there's so many benefits to the strategy you share. And it's not like you have to read a book about how to employ it. It's really you fix it to your schedule. But some of the benefits I see is you get the grade, which is the achievement. If you have achievement goals, you also get that kind of relationship with the content, that engagement that we crave, that purpose by doing it slowly. And then after this is all said and done, you now have a skill set and a way of thinking that can be applied to anything you undertake after that. And it's when you're telling me all this, I didn't think of this last time, but now hearing you say this now, you're quite multifaceted. I mean, obviously, in the way you think about your profession, but also in other areas, like you're also into music, you're also a yoga instructor, you're also managing, having a successful relationship at home. Do you want to maybe expound on how that has helped you with those things, or if it has at all?
Yeah, I think that idea of just like things take time sometimes. I kind of like, in some way, I'm sure I have that in the back of my head. Not to say like you shouldn't like go after things, you shouldn't be ambitious, etc. You should. But I also know that like, let me say that a different way.
Okay, sure.
In my business, Startup Hype Man, my consulting business, there are things that I know today that I did not know 3 years ago when I was, in the first year of this business. And I knew at that time, even 3 years ago, I was like, there are things that I don't yet know that I'm going to learn the longer I stick with this and the longer I do this. Mm-hmm. And I could get upset that I don't know those things yet. And I can get upset that other people I know in the similar age or similar style of company are more successful or have achieved more. But I didn't so much get caught up in that comparison game with other entrepreneurs doing, consulting style businesses, because I was like, well, they started at a different point than me. Their base knowledge on a topic, or the execution of that base knowledge, I should say, is a little bit different. And maybe they started their business entirely, well before me.
Mm-hmm.
And I also knew, I was like, it's not like I can just start like speed reading to learn either, because there's stuff that I don't even know yet that I don't know. And that natural learning process is going to come out over time. I remember a couple of years ago, I was on, I think it was on someone's podcast. I don't remember whose, but they were kind of asking me like, what am I most excited about with my business? And at the time, I remember saying, the thing I'm most excited about is like knowing how much I've learned this far. I'm so excited to learn the things that I don't even know exist yet, because it's going to be so much fun when I find out they exist and I end up learning about those things. And that's really, I think, what this journey has been, whether it's this business or whether it's teaching or just practicing yoga, right? There's all these things that you can try to like preempt it as much as possible. And in many ways you can get ahead of the game in that respect. So again, I'm not saying I'm sitting here being anti-ambitious by any means. That's not the point. The point is, I think no matter how ambitious you are, there are certain things that a certain amount of time just needs to elapse, and you have to be willing to, in your pursuit, also have a degree of patience, because certain things are just going to come along at a certain time because of certain actions or behaviors, or just because enough time has elapsed that you could have never foreseen before. And because you just wouldn't have even known that thing existed. Even if you read all the books, even if you read all the success stories before you, right? There's certain things you can preempt for, certain things you can plan for, but there's, I think, more things that come with just staying in the game.
Yeah, experiential learning is the strongest learning. And it's also like what you were saying with engagement is like so big part of you getting information, and you retained information better when you're engaging with the material slowly. I can only imagine when you're living that over extended periods of time. And hearing that, hearing you explain that perspective, I'm wondering, is there like a method to you kind of deploying that level of patience and expectation setting? I know you use tools like yoga and meditation, which are really powerful. Maybe you can talk about some strategies you deploy there, or maybe it could be even something like the way you journal or the way you set your mind at lunchtime, tips of that nature. Is there anything you can like offer in that regard?
Well, so I don't journal, and I've tried before, and it hasn't stuck. I have a semi-consistent meditation practice, but even that I wouldn't say is all the time daily. I think I go through spurts where it's daily, and I go through spurts where it's not. I think right now I'm on like a accidental like 3-day or 4-day break. Not planned. It just, it happened that way. So I do say that there's a lot of power in having a consistent daily habit. Yes, I'm probably not the best representative of that, because I find ways for things to fall by the wayside. More than anything, I think a lot of this idea of like the patience mindset, I think it just kind of comes from like this almost like self-admission. So being able to admit to yourself that there is always going to be more things out there that I don't know compared to what I do know. And when you come to that realization that there's always going to be more stuff that I don't know than I do know, because there's just too much information out there, and it's so vast. I think it's just helped me better come to terms with where I'm at. And again, it doesn't mean I'm not trying to do things to accelerate pace or accelerate growth. But I also know that there's almost like these certain like zones of acceleration. and I can accelerate within the zone to a certain extent, but it's not going to get me 3 zones ahead just because I hit the gas once. So that's really, I think, if I'm truly honest with myself, I think that's what it is. It's just that I know that there's always more stuff out there that I don't know than what I do know. And so it does 2 things. It keeps me humble to an extent. Some may argue that I'm not so humble. So it keeps me humble to an extent. It allows me to have that patience. And then the third thing I would say, though, is that it keeps me in the game and it keeps me interested. Because if there's always more to learn, like, my God, like, how fun is that? And how cool and how interesting is it to just always be interested in something?
Man, it's a really cool thing to start developing that passion. And if you not yet have it, see the potential for it and keep working till those feelings arise in you where you want to wake up and learn those things. And I think a big challenge, though, is that people do feel overwhelmed with that vast amount of information out there, that they become complacent, maybe for 2 reasons. One being the reason I just said, whoa, look at all this stuff. How do I eat all this food at this buffet? Do I have to eat it all?
Yeah.
How do I eat it? And then another component of that's kind of fleeting me is finding that lane you want to stick in, right? And I think that's a big challenge, is like, you have this massive information. How do you cut it up in pieces where you figure out what resides with your purpose, your personal brand, your vision? Is there, I mean, maybe for you it's straightforward, but if you were to look in for yourself, is there a way that, it seems like you're very simple, so I imagine you have a simple answer for this, but is there like a really simple way you just look at something and you're saying, should I undertake this? Or how should I go about learning this subject?
That might be the first time someone has said that I'm simple. It's good to know that I'm not as complex as I'm often made out to be.
No, I don't think so. I think you're always pretty straight, to me at least. Yeah, for sure.
I don't know. I feel like I just feel like I'm logical, I guess, about a lot of things, with a hint of optimism, but it's almost like managed optimism, as opposed to blind optimism. The idea of picking your lane, I think, is very much, it becomes a lot easier once you figure out your why, your WHY, your why. A great starting point with that, and this was something that totally changed the way I thought about myself and honestly, like, all of my surroundings, was about 8 or 9 years ago at this point. I saw this TED talk by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. And it was about this concept he has called the Golden Circle. You familiar with that?
No, I'm not, but I'm happy to hear it. It sounds
Yeah.
good.
So, I mean, I'll give the cliff notes of it, but it's
Sure.
definitely worth watching. And I think even behind me on this bookshelf, I have one of his books there called Find Your Why. The concept that he presented was that everyone on the planet knows what they do, but very few people know why they do it. And if you look at the most effective leaders throughout history, they knew their why and they led with their why and they communicated from the place of why. Whereas most people communicate from the outside in. They start with what. So the golden circle, as he maps out, is three concentric circles, one inside the other. The outermost layer is what. The second layer is how. And then the middle layer, the inner layer, is why. So everyone operates on this plane of what, how, and why. Most people operate from the outside in. They know what they do. They know what they like. And some people know how they do that thing or those things. But very few people ever know the why behind it. But the successful leaders, the successful businesses over time, they know their why and they lead with their why. They communicate with their why. They start from the inside out. Why, how, what, instead of what, how, why. And so when I saw that, it again, it fundamentally just like changed the way that I see things. It fundamentally changed the way I looked at myself, and it made me kind of go on this like deep journey of self-reflection. And in that process, what I came to over time was, and ultimately I would end up creating my first business around this concept of helping people figure it out for themselves. But for me, what I found was that my why was this deep-rooted belief in expression. And my fundamental belief as a human being is that people should be able to express themselves. And like the greatest crime in my mind is when someone's expression, their freedom of expression, has been taken from them, or they feel like they cannot. And I don't mean that in like a governmental sense, like you probably shouldn't yell out racial slurs in public. I'm not saying that that's like a restricting of freedom of expression, because that's just something you shouldn't do. I mean restricted more in the sense of like some deep belief that they want to express in a certain way. They feel like they can't because they're worried about what their family might say, or they're worried about what their friends might say, or they view themselves as, I'm not the type of person who does that, or who thinks like that, or who says that. Those are the way, like, to me, that's like the greatest crime, when someone is forced to limit themselves in that way. So my why is this belief in expression. That's why I believe I'm on this earth, is to create more expression in the universe. My how, the way I bring about expression, is through different forms of storytelling. And so those are like the A-B notes that I play: expression, storytelling, expression through storytelling, storytelling in the name of expression. And with that as my core, my what's plural, all feed from that. And that's where it might make sense that I do the different things that I do. So at this point, the main things that I'm involved in, I have my consulting practice, Startup Hype Man, helping growing companies figure out their voice. I have yoga, which, as a student and as a teacher of yoga, I literally look at the construct of a class as like the unfolding of a story. And yoga is very much about, especially at least the physical practice of yoga, is about your physical expression on the mat. Creating music, right? That's a form of expression. I think that's obvious. And being a rapper, right? Song is a form of story. Especially a lot of hip hop is a form of storytelling.
Of course.
Right? And so all these different things that I get involved in, and I look at like, what are the things that I'm attracted to? It is the things that allow me to manifest expression via storytelling, and storytelling in the name of expression. And so it makes it easier to figure out what to say yes to, makes it easier to figure out what to say no to. You know, more in the past couple of years, I've also gotten pretty heavily involved in both studying as well as teaching different workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why do I care about that? Well, because to me, DEI, through my lens, an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion is emphasizing each type of person's ability to express. And the way I would teach that kind of stuff is through storytelling, right? Or it's how I would infuse storytelling into the way I teach material. So that, I mean, to come back to your question of like, when everything is available, how do you pick your lane? It comes down to that. Like, what is your why and what's your how? And then you can, like, the what's start to fall naturally into place after that. And the interesting thing that I found from especially my work in my previous company, doing this for a lot of other people, is, you know, barring some crazy life event, like you go into witness protection, the decisions a person has made to this point in their life, the important decisions, I should say, tend to fall in line with their why and their how. And the decisions they will continue to make, whether they are conscious of it or not, tend to fall in line with their why and their how. The important decisions and the decisions they care about, I should say. So it's really helpful to be able to understand this about yourself, so that way you can start to almost like better navigate it and direct it in a certain way.
Mhm.
But even if you don't, you're naturally already doing these things because you have a why, you have a how, and the important decisions that you make tend to reflect your why and your how. And interestingly enough, through that work that we were doing, we found that the important decisions that did not align with the why and the how were also the times when those people were unhappiest in their life. So maybe they fell off course, but then later on they did something to course correct to get back on track. Or they're perhaps in that process of trying to course correct right now.
Wow, that's like some heavy stuff, man. You got me thinking. It's like just like, you know what I mean? It's, as you're saying all that stuff, it's hard not to become self-reflective. And I'm sure anybody hearing this, like, I had a lot of aha moments, even though I know why the why is important, but I think you explained it in a very clear way, and you told the story well enough and sold the why's value. Um, and I think it is important to have that, because that'll also make you more motivated to study for things or prepare for things like you do farther out, and avoid things like distractions. I mean, today more than ever, especially in quarantine, grown adults and the youth of tomorrow, especially the ones that are still developing, are under scrutiny from electronics, social media, news. And I said this on another episode, whether this comes before or after that. 3 minutes of internet a day takes away happiness and levels of motivation. Just 3 minutes. And I watched the impact theory, and a gentleman said that people who watched the news for 2 minutes a day reported like a much higher percentage of saying they had a bad day. So if you think about it now, more than
Wow.
ever, the news really wants us to watch the news, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like that is a big pressure when you're trying to figure out a voice and trying to maintain happiness. And I think maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but for me, I see a direct remedy to that through finding your why, your what, your how, and then having an expectation that is reasonable, being patient, going on for the journey, and kind of just working through that process and preparing for things in advance. And I think you kind of feel that, like, that's kind of what I was feeling like when you're saying that. I feel like it just really is perfect for the time we're in right now. Again, for the youth of tomorrow that are highly impressionable, but to the 45-year-old man who has 5 kids and is struggling right now.
Yeah, I think it's helpful now. If for no other reason than when you're locked inside, why not just do some self-reflection, right? Why not take out a piece of paper and write down all the different things that you enjoy and you care about, and start to figure out, is there a common thread behind these things, right? There are specific questions you can do as well that help, and that was what we had kind of gotten it down to a process, and in some ways a science when we were doing this for other people. So some of those questions that you can ask yourself are, what is a memory from, well, and I should say, since this is intended for the younger crowd today, I'll speak to it in sort of like a present tense way for them. Think about let's say your high school experience. What is a memory that you have up to this point that every time you think about it makes you smile? And not just what is that event, but what is it about that event that makes you smile? Who else was involved? What were like the circumstances leading up to that? Right? Like almost like craft the story for yourself to answer that question. And then another question you can ask yourself: if you had 3 extra hours in the day, how would you spend that time? And let's assume like you're free of your responsibilities. How would you spend that 3 extra hours in the day? Another question: what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want your, one way we used to ask it is like, write your own eulogy, which is kind of messed up, but it's an interesting thing to do. It's an interesting exercise to do. And I always thought what was interesting was whenever we would do that, not one person would Not one person, and we did this for hundreds of people, not one person ever said anything about their job. They never said anything about making money in what they wanted to be remembered for. I should correct that. One person did talk about money, but he said he wanted to accumulate a certain amount of wealth so that before he died, he could give it all away. And so even in the one case where money was brought up, it was in the case of being like charitable. So, those are just a few different questions you can ask yourself to get started. But what you start to see is that if you really are honest with yourself and you don't just answer the question, but then you answer some of those like circumstances surrounding it, like why are those things important to you, et cetera. Another good question is, what's something you haven't accomplished yet, but you want to? Again, if you answer these questions honestly and you actually reflect in the process and you answer the question, but then also like you answer, why do I care about that? Why is that important to me? Who else is involved? Those kinds of things. You'll start to see there is some common thread behind all of it. And that common thread ends up being your why and your how.
That's some powerful stuff. I'm going to take those questions down after for sure.
It's a pretty cool reflection exercise. I highly recommend doing it with someone else. So they can kind of like probe you further and ask kind of like sidebar questions related to it. It's got to be someone you trust who you can be totally honest with. That's why I recommend staying away from like family members, although some people do have a certain totally honest relationship with their family members where they can say that stuff no problem, but I know a lot of people struggle with that. So it helps to have someone who you have that like amazing relationship with. It also really works well with someone you don't know at all. And when we were doing those workshops back in the day, we'd pair people up who had just met that night, but they would leave knowing more about each other than people that they had respectively known for years.
Yeah, that's a great exercise. There's something when you meet somebody you don't know, almost sometimes it's daunting at first, but you end up feeling more relaxed because you realize what you're exposing isn't that bad and you're doing it with a stranger. So it
There's
goes
no
with that.
repercussions because they are
No
a stranger.
repercussion.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you most likely make a new friend, out of that.
Correct.
It's going to be hard
Yeah.
not to connect with that person. Well, I don't want to bombard the listeners or potential viewers with too much information. Everybody, I'm going to make a little white paper of this intel, make some LinkedIn posts and etc., and try and give you digestible content from this. But so yeah, if you don't have a pen and paper handy, I'll make sure to shoot you guys something. But Rajiv, man, that was super helpful, even for myself, but I'm sure for anybody listening. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks
My
so much for
pleasure.
coming through, man. Stay
Thanks
in
for having
touch.
me.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for joining us today. Have a good one.
Everyone, hey, thanks so much for checking our third episode of our talk series over here at Empowered Life Hacks. Rajiv shared a lot, right? But importantly, we learned this one simple thing. Finding your why helps you cultivate a little more discipline. And by you being a bit more disciplined on a daily basis, you can stay en route to finding your why and living your why. And as you live your why and you have that compass, you go straight towards having more fun in your life, straight towards helping other people achieve more in their life, and you becoming a more whole person and more satisfied with yourself at the end of the day. And now for our next episode, right, we overcame instant gratification to the best of our ability. We started having more fun throughout our day with episode 2. We cultivated a bit of discipline to put this all together. And now we have Jess coming to talk about reading. Reading can be this mundane task, but is one of the most effective ways to acquire new information to now attach to your why. And not only that, it's actually a form of meditation if you knew that. So if you come check us out on episode 4, it's going to be really good. There's so many tips. It's just I can't fathom the benefit of learning about how to read more effectively and have more fun with reading with Jessica Benson. So I'm looking forward to see you folks in 2 weeks. Go on our website right now. We have all our actionable tips, all our actionable takeaways, power sheets and power tools and worksheets and summary notes and everything you want there to help you digest this information from this episode and live a more fulfilled life is there. I look forward to catching you folks very soon. Have a good one. Ciao.